Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Baron Harper. I am Senior Director of Global Client Development for our Pharma portfolio at the Trade Desk. And if anyone is unfamiliar with the Trade Desk, we help the biggest brands in the world buy ads online. And the largest pharma advertisers trust us to drive audience quality and script lift with banner ads, streaming audio and podcast ads, digital out of home, mobile, retail media, and especially connected TV. And we've been kind of teasing out some of our upcoming first-of-a-kind measurement and optimization capabilities. There'll be a lot more to come about that as we open up our betas in the next couple months. But for today, I'm joined by an incredible panel to talk about cookieless. And so before we dive in, I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Francis and go down the line.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Francis Daunt. I am an SVP of Addressable Health at Matterkind.
Hi, everyone. I am Melissa Gordon-Ring, and I am the Global President of Health at Initiative.
Hello, Rob Zeiger. I am with AstraZeneca. I'm Senior Director of Marketing for our Vaccines and Immunotherapies Group.
Steve Romney from Lilly, the lead consumer analytics.
Awesome. And so for anyone who might have been confused by the title of the panel, it's okay. Cookies are digital identifiers that we use to serve targeted ads online and measure user behavior. Since Google says they're taking away cookies in 2024, marketers need to find alternative signals to serve relevant ads and make sure that ad exposure is being tied to business outcomes. So we're going to discuss some ideas for navigating the cookieless future, as well as upcoming state regulations that change the way that we will operate. So first question, it's going to be rapid fire for everybody. We'll start with Francis, all right? Place yourself, the year is 2024, the day cookies go away. What's your number one priority?
For us, I think it's having a real game plan for how to activate first-party data and also make sure that we're continuing to think about how to collect more of that and leverage more of that in the future.
So I love how you're optimistic about 2024, because who knows when it's really going to happen. The things that I think are most critical when we think about this and the future is really about safety and hygiene. Making sure that everything is clean, that the data is as clean as possible, which will help us better understand where we can play in a safe and compliant way.
So for the brand, it's going to be making sure that our segments are as tightly knit as possible, that our micro segments are identified as best as possible, that our insights are as clean as possible, and that we understand how to be as relevant as possible, since the data will be a little bit scattered to do so.
I'd say really two things. First-party data, and in our industry, how do we convince our customers to be willing to share it with us? Right, so think about that. It's a big trust barrier. And the second piece, and as we have a lot of network partners in the room, we talk about sort of what are the actual state laws. And we also, the terminology we use is spirit of the law. And so as we look at our partners, we've got to review networks and say, who's up to speed? Where we have some risks? And how do we make sure we're accounting for that appropriately?
It's true. So let's drill down, Steve, on that first-party data piece for a second. So with all the changes coming, especially on the state level, like you mentioned, how are you rethinking your first-party data strategy?
Yeah, so there's, and I'm assuming other companies are similar. I'd love to say that our house is clean all the time. And because we've built our ecosystem based on brand experiences, we've got islands of data. They're all governed appropriately, but they're not necessarily connected. They're not necessarily connected in a way that becomes an enterprise asset. So that you can say, gosh, did someone give me permission for one of our brands one way, and a different version of permission on another brand or another experience? And if so, how do we transition that to a way that we can understand what their real preference is and then calibrate their experience to those pieces? So part of what we're doing is taking a look at our ecosystem today, we're not waiting, and starting to adjust and saying, what are the best practices that leaders are using today? How do we start building those and using them? Let's not wait.
Definitely. Yeah, when you're talking about calibrating the experiences, obviously it's super important to be able to have the ability to identify users in order to calibrate that experience. So I want to go to Melissa and Steve on this. So obviously, state privacy laws cause us a lot of headaches as marketers, right? But if we take off our marketer hat, I don't think anyone in this room objectively would say that increased privacy protection is a bad thing. So how are you reorienting your teams to think about, reaching consumers just in a more privacy-centric way moving forward?
I think there's a lot of different things that we can do and that we're already doing, part of which is almost structuring our teams in a future forward way to ensure that there is compliance knowledge with people who are specifically dedicated around understanding compliance laws, rules, the impact on privacy, as well as ensuring that we install and create guardrails in our processes. So when things are happening, and we talk about in the spirit of what's happening in Washington and other states are going to follow, we know that that's the case. But the reality is how are we also ensuring that our systems are in place to stop us from being the first pharma account to make a big boo-boo, we'll just say. And the reality is that we have to be proactive about that and train our teams differently and align with the privacy entities within our clients' organizations, within our pharma company partners, to ensure that we understand what's most critical to them as well, and that we are mirroring that in everything that we do, from structure to process to output.
Yeah. From the data and analytics side of things, how are you thinking about it, Steve?
Yeah, so I think there's two key things for us. Like, I'm assuming if I asked everybody to raise their hands, almost everybody in the room has one form or another of a privacy team, right? And sometimes they're this group that I'm not sure if I want to go talk to. So we actually I probably talk to my privacy team 4 out of 5 days a week, right? So they are a part of our team. I'd say that as an analytics organization. The second piece that we take a look at is saying, hey, so because they're part of our team, how do we shift from, I think a lot of us have people-driven governance, really good policies, written organizations, but they rely on people to execute them. And that's part of where the risk comes in. And so how do you shift your MarTech ecosystems, ad tech as well, to become deployable governance? So when we think about the way you may work with data products based on permissioning, the way consumers have let us know who they are and how we can use their data, is that something that you can configure and deploy across your ecosystem? Or are we relying on the interpretation of the members of our teams to come up with the right solutions and make the right decisions 100% of the time? We think that's a big ask. We think there's some pieces we can do in the way you configure ecosystems to help us lower the risk, right? So part of that is not just everything, so like modeling the end that we do. It's actually in the beginning when you think about the way you build your data products and the way that you enable them to pass through into model ecosystems and structure governance in a way that you can actually protect your teams.
So this next one is going to be for Melissa and Francis. I want to dive a little deeper into the kind of tactical, more strategic side of things. So how are you building out a learning agenda for cookieless? Hey, yo.
Let's go.
All right. How are you?
Mood lighting.
Yeah, let's take it down. So how are you building out a learning agenda for cookieless that on one hand looks at vetting individual like data targeting and measurement providers, and on the other hand understands that you've got to have like a holistic strategy incorporating multiple signals, because as of now at least there isn't really one identifier to rule them all. So maybe Melissa and then Francis.
Sure. I think the reality is that we have to be testing now. We have to be testing as much as we can with as many of our partners as possible, because the realities are we are going to learn from our successes and our failures to ensure that we are as prepared as humanly possible. And the reality is we won't be prepared for certain things. But more importantly, what can we learn? How can we do it on an ongoing basis? Ensure that we are empowering our teams too to make themselves a little bit uncomfortable as well when having conversations with partners and clients about maybe looking at things a different way. The reality is too is within our industry, we've always had to be a little bit more creative or strategic in order to drive innovation, but we have to do that for the sake of our businesses and for the sake of our patients to figure out the best ways to connect with them, because if we do that well, we give them the chance to feel a little bit better or more in control of something that they are not in control of.
Yeah, and to kind of touch on that too, and Baron, you mentioned this a little bit, I think it's understanding the importance of universal identifiers and how they're going to replace the cookie whenever this cookieless ecosystem becomes a reality. So one of the things that we've done at IPG and that we're really excited about, an advantage that we have in-house, is that Axiom and Kinesso, so kind of like our audience and data arms, have both built their own private operators for UID2, which means that for any Axiom ID, any Kinesso ID that has an email address tied to it, we can generate a UID2 for it without that PII ever leaving IPG's walls. So what that means is both of those parties can send deterministic identifiers in the form of those UID2s directly to the trade desk in addition to device IDs, to cookies, which means that we get higher match rates, we're minimizing the costs of onboarding, and we're helping our brands really build a cookieless footprint for the future.
Totally. Kind of, I want to pivot a little bit, but still on the subject of kind of durable identifiers. So we'll go to Rob first on this one. I want to talk about retail media and CTV. So over the last year, I know especially at the trade desk, we've seen this massive shift of spend going to retail and CTV, and I think part of that is because we're following the consumers into the new environments that they're adopting, but also from a marketing standpoint, we have access now to authenticated, logged-in user bases, which is really great when we think about durability moving into the cookieless future. So, curious from your standpoint, how are retail media and CTV playing into 2024 planning compared to previous years, and then also like internally, how are you getting kind of buy-in for innovative ideas and just emerging channels in general?
Yeah, no, it's complicated, but as far as connected TV goes, I think it's about bringing people along for the ride. It's about having them think about TV in a different means, right? So traditionally TV is used in mass, it's used to reach a great deal of an audience, but now you can kind of turn that sideways and use it as a targeted approach because you know who the people are. So working with our omni-channel strategy team, working with our media strategy team, we understand how we can deploy TV differently. And thanks to it being connected, it's not just on a sofa, it's wherever your device is. And so that enables it to be scalable, it enables it to be targeted, and it also enables us from a creative standpoint to think differently. So when you're now shooting a commercial, you're not saying, okay, well, what's my call to action at the end? It's what's my call to action for this particular audience, and where do I want to deploy it, and how do I want to deploy it? To answer the second part of your question, to explain that up in an organization can sometimes be complicated. So I think it's about understanding what you're going to measure and clearly communicating why you're measuring that through this new means, right? So TV, again, traditionally is going to be about awareness, but now it may be about an actual action you're asking your audience to take, how you can measure it, how you can deem that it was successful, how you can deem that it wasn't successful, and quickly pivoting. But it's definitely exciting for us because in a world where targeting is going to become more complicated, you can leverage a means that wasn't traditionally used as a targeted methodology.
Absolutely. And kind of, especially on the point of kind of being able to prove efficacy, and I think we can double click on retail a bit here because obviously one of the reasons why it's exploding is just the feedback loop that especially across other categories you get. But for pharma in particular, one thing we look at is just these unique data sets that they have to offer, and there are pros and cons to the signals you can get there. But I want to pose this for everybody. We're getting a ton of questions about retail because, especially as a trade desk, it's relatively new as far as opening up programmatic access. So we've got all these retailers like Walgreens, Kroger, Walmart, et cetera. For you all, in your respective organizations, what role is retail media playing now and as you look into 2024? I guess let's start with you, Melissa.
I'll jump in first. So retail is critical, right? We know it's growing. We know that there's so much opportunity. It allows us to really understand two specific signals that could be tied to how our patients, even HCPs, are feeling or how they're spending their time, what's important to them. It's such an important path for the future, I think, that IPG has invested in the creation of a retail entity to allow us to truly aggregate the space, because you're right. The reality is that everyone who sells something is now building a retail network to allow access for advertisers to speak to their consumers. And for us in the pharma space, it's so important for us to understand that landscape. Is that something that is going to be compelling to our audiences, to our patients, or not, because we learn either way. But the reality is that we have to continue to find new opportunities as well to reach the people we want to speak to in the right way with the right content, and how that feeds into kind of the larger plan of impressions and engagements and contact that we have across the board. Does it enhance it? Does it substitute? What can we learn from it? It will play a critical piece in the future of what our plans look like.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I've been at Matterkind for about 10 years, and at the pharma specific space for probably 6 or 7. And something that always used to really get on my nerves is anytime there's any sort of emerging format, like an innovative strategy. Thinking of like when CTE was first becoming like a really big thing in the industry. All the other verticals kind of got to test that out first. And for us on the pharma side, it's always like, well, it's going to take a couple more years to get to that point where you can test this out. And then obviously, like, you know, a little bit of hesitancy with being the first pharma brand to do that always kind of adds a little bit more time. To Melissa's point, that retail specialty team that we're investing in, we're now seeing for, you know, what I really think is the first time, like a lot of thinking through solutions for pharma specifically as it pertains to retail media. So we might have a lot more limited and more nuanced opportunities within that retail space as pharma advertisers, but it's still out there, and you know, we're at least having the conversation, thinking through that. And I think what Rob was touching on a little bit before as well with the success of the CTV stories that we've seen, a lot of strong campaigns that we've run that have driven real results for a lot of our brands, has kind of helped open up some of those preconceived notions that we had before.
Yeah. On the brand side, Rob, anything to add?
I think it's just another opportunity to be relevant to our audience. It presents an exciting new option for us. I question where in the life cycle it fits in for the brand. I mean, I think that this is more of a persistency play. At least that's where my head initially goes. Is I can be relevant to somebody that's not expecting necessarily a message, but I'm also not going to give them like the full soup to nuts message. I'm going to give them a, hey, remember me. So that way it's just another place that I can do that with them, for them, and it means it's contextual. The question I have is how do you do that without necessarily being creepy? Because there's the whole thing about where you show up, and then you also have to balance it with, you know, our media partners do a great job of when there's a news story and they pull us off a news website, how do you make sure that you're not next to a product you don't want to be next to as well? So there's just different things you have to be mindful of.
Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, and I think maybe a couple things as we take a look at it. So you ask, like, are we testing it? We are. One of the questions we ask is, there's more data. How do you know if it's different than what you're already executing on, right? So when you think about those signals, whether they're for conditioned audiences, whether they're for lookalikes, what you're really looking to see is, am I going to get incremental quality reach that's going to convert differently than I'm already buying? Because if it's not, many times we're either just duplicating, or in some cases, you're going to pay a premium for some of the networks as they're starting compared to what you're already doing. And we've got to get to that sort of econometric view to say, we get it. They want to make money. We like being in their places where our customers are. That totally makes sense. But it's got to be an and. It can't be where we're duplicating, increasing spend without seeing incrementality on the business side. I think that's where our questions are right now as we take a look and try to make sure we understand that piece, because to your points, Aaron and everybody at the panel, we're seeing them pop up everywhere. Like everybody who has data saying, hey, it's permissioned, I can sell it, it can become a product. Just because it's sold doesn't necessarily mean we should buy right away. We have to think through and say, how's it going to help?
It's a really important consideration, because I think even as us, you know, we get so excited because we're like, hey, we have access to all these retailers, and you know, we want everybody to test them and to use them. But at the same time, to your point, I mean, it has to be incremental. But like, you know, something that we always think about, and we've seen borne out a little bit in the testing so far, is, you know, what do you think about it as an incremental opportunity to reach audiences who, you know, are pre-diagnosis, for instance, especially given the, you know, the seeds that are being used for some of the other third-party data sets out there.
So I think this comes back to Robert's point on life cycle, right? If you think about most of the brands in pharma, a lot of times we're not in the business of talking to somebody before they have a condition, right? Because context and relevance don't necessarily fit, right? Usually you need that diagnosis where we're saying, okay, we're now relevant. And so if I do that before, think about how many different places, not in pharma, that are vying for all of our attention today, right? That's the part where at least the perspective we have so far is, if it's a condition that somebody has already, and you're talking about treatment progression, makes a ton of sense. Before diagnosis, we've had a hard time. And I think there's been examples industry-wide, like everybody probably remembers the Target one, right, with pregnancy, where you start using advanced analytics to start to predict who's likely to, and that's some really interesting territory with some of the conversations around artificial intelligence, right? And those are the other things we're talking about right now. It's saying, hey, as our capabilities expand on the AI side, that's bringing some different ethics questions. That's tied into privacy, tied into what we're doing. But as an industry, how do we make sure we land in the right space in that spot?
Yeah. it's super important. It kind of brings it all full circle because, yeah, I mean, these are really cool ideas, interesting, testing opportunities, but especially with the upcoming regulations, the stuff that's already rolling out, we have to completely rethink how we, go about using these different data sets. And so, for all the work that we do with all of you, really appreciate the rigor that you put into those processes. So this is the last question, and this is for everybody. And then I think we might have a little time to open it up a little bit for questions. Statistically, there's like 55% of advertisers who are not at all prepared for the cookieless future. I think part of that is a consequence of the dates getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. But one day, theoretically, it's going to come. So for you all, what's like one thing that you would recommend to someone coming in new to a position like yours? What's one thing that they can do today to start getting ready for that cookieless future? Let's start with Francis. Move on.
I'm going to go back to what Melissa said at the beginning. I think it's really important that you have a consistent and thorough testing framework. I think one of the worst things that could have happened for our industry is the first time the cookieless date got pushed back, because I think a lot of us are now just assuming it'll get pushed back again, and maybe it will, and maybe it will again. But when that date finally comes, having as much concrete data, understanding which of the universal identifiers are working for you, what content partners have helped you out with cookieless strategies is really important to make sure you're positioned ahead of everyone else.
I think it's important to understand what permission actually means, and ensuring that we are clear about what that means, not just to the people that we're trying to speak to, but to our clients, to our partners, and really being thoughtful about the way that we will be using data in the future. So much about even the action of giving permission is a little bit lost. I think in all of this, I laugh. I was explaining to my mom this morning about the panel. She's like, "Tell me what you're talking about." I'm like, "Okay." So I'm like, "Okay, so there's a cookie." She's like, "Oh, you mean that thing?" I was really surprised, actually, positively. She's like, on that thing when you get to a website and they ask you, "Are you okay? Do you allow cookies?" She's like, "Oh, I didn't know what it meant." That was so important. That really resonated to me. Where people just click, right? We know what it means, but most people don't necessarily know what that means. So how can we also make sure that we're advocating for that awareness? Because there will be questions, there will be not just backlash, but true, why, the why behind it. Why did I give that? I didn't understand it. So how can we be thoughtful about the action of permission and holding people accountable for, what we've said yes to or no to, for that matter?
Rob?
For the brand, I think it's just understanding as much as possible about our patient, our consumer, our target audience, right? So that we can work with people on the panel here with me to make the best informed decisions. So as much as possible, we need to understand our customer down to a T, what they're disinterested in, where they're likely to take action, why they're likely to take action, all of this, the marketing principles. I know this probably isn't the pearl you were hoping for, but that is what, as a brand, we need to be prepared to do to enable the functions that we work with to be as best informed as possible to act on our behalf.
And I think the part for us is don't wait, right? I think there's a little bit of it, which is we're waiting for the perfect solution to emerge, right? And it doesn't feel like that's going to happen. It feels like this is going to be one of those where we're going to step through some things and have to start to adjust. And so think about getting chain of command and control on how your execution's working all the way through the ecosystem, not just on your owned and operated properties. But as we go out into the marketplace and somebody asks a question, if somebody opted out, can you pull them from your execution? Right? It's kind of that's the easy question. That's the one we all start with. And if the answer is no, we already know today we need to be able to do that. Right? So how do we go through and start to adjust? And that's been a big focus, is to say, gosh, I've got to be able to answer that one. That one's pretty easy. There's others that are more complicated, but that's the easy one to start with. And if the answer is no there, I don't have to look much deeper. Right? So how do I get that to be a yes?
Yeah, so I don't know who I'm looking for. I think do we have time for one or two questions? Awesome. Anyone out there want to ask a question? I saw you first. Go for it.
I think that's a great question. I think the reality is that we put agreements in place with the partners that we're working with, and as well as, the reality of the strength of our infrastructure. And some data we're okay taking, and some data we're not. And I'm sure a lot of you guys experience that too, and the level of comfort. And that truly is about being safe. So ensuring that you are clear about what, that we are clear about what we will ingest, what we can ingest in our, through our partnerships with Condeso and Axiom, as Francis said, but, being very deliberate with what that is, and the why behind it is the first step of anything. You bring on a new client, or you transition a different piece of business, or you gain access to something. It's really understanding, what are those sources? Do we have the right infrastructure to take that in a safe way, and ensuring that there's crystal clarity around what those parameters are. And you do some testing first just to make sure, but there has to be a lot of rigor.
Second, I think there was one more over here somewhere. One more? Yeah.
Yeah, I really just wanted to ask about your thoughts about the iOS 17 changes and Safari private browsing, link tracking, protection, anything about that?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, I think it goes back to Melissa's answer to this question and kind of what she was saying before. Like, we have realized that there is so much to keep track of in the industry as it pertains to all these privacy changes, like kind of what the cookieless future looks like and all these other topics. So we have we have a team within. Did my voice just get a lot louder? Sorry. We have like a team within IPG that's focused on kind of issuing these POVs for stuff like that, and I think this is gonna. It's a lot of kind of that test and learn that we figured out before. It's not, we think we might know what the impact is of something like iOS 17 coming out, but you can't really understand the full impact until, like I said before, you kind of have a little bit of that concrete data. So we make sure we have POVs when these things come out, kind of a general understanding of what we think the impact will be, but we're not fully going to understand it until we can test it out a little more.
I think there's probably the other piece is we've got some idea, right? Because we know there's going to be signal deprecation, right? We're going to lose some. So when you think about the capabilities that you have, we've all talked about like different measurement ecosystems, whether it's attribution, mixed models, and like how are we getting to a collage of tools that'll help us start to do that? Well, now we're going to have to bring in some more, right? So we get into data projection techniques, when we get into techniques around synthetic data, right? And how are we able to start operating knowing that deprecation is happening with the signals we have, and what capabilities do we have to understand the parts that you can see, are they representative, right? If they're not, right, that might be okay, that might be how you have to operate, but have we started to ask those questions? Is that how we're thinking about operating our measurement frameworks and then applying those insights to the way we operate our businesses?
I think that's all we have time for. But thank you to our amazing panelists. Super informative.